from page 380, any questions from the homework that you would like me to go over? Now is your chance to ask. Now, if you didn't do it, you need to get this done. Factoring is one thing that takes practice. However, when you practice, there comes suddenly a magic moment. Your brain will actually develop a new circuit. Joel, I used to literally, when I taught Math 10, because this used to be Math 10, I used to give my kids 100 of these. 100? Yeah. And by about the 40th question, their brains would suddenly just see the answer. They couldn't even tell you how they were seeing the answer. What had happened was their brain had simply created a circuit that was doing it automatically. Our brains are quite impressive. But the only way I know how to get there, Kiara, is to practice. Any of these from numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, I skipped 4, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 that you want me to go over, keeping in mind that 6E was wrong. Back of the book, correct answer. You'd factor out a 4x, because I can factor out a 4 and an x from both terms, yes? When I factor a 4 out of a 16, an x is left behind. When I factor an x from an x squared, an x is left behind. There's a minus sign that would drop down. When I factor a 4x out of a 4x, what number is left behind? Not 0. What number is left behind? A 1. That should be what the answer is. I don't think that's what the back says. Now we get to the trickier factoring, the ones that honestly even I kind of loathe, but they're the most common kind. Can you turn please to lesson 2, which is page 385? Page 385. Pass the seating plan around, make sure it gets people who haven't had it yet. Once it's been around to everybody, once the diagram is completely filled in, just bring it back to the front of me. Page 385. And Zach, now that you're done the pretzels, what we're going to ask ourselves is simply, remember I said to you last time, is there something in front of the quadratic? And you guys said no. We're going to say, Rachel, what if there is? And unfortunately, that does make it more of a challenge. There's no easy way to do it in your head. Although Adrian, I found after I did about 100 of them, suddenly my brain would somehow magically sort of do them in my head, but you just have to practice. Complete the following. Remember this from Math 10? You had an acronym. What did you call this? It began with the letter F and ended in an L. The acronym was FOIL, which stood for multiply the first ones, then the outside ones, then the inside ones, then the last ones. Honestly, what I remember is multiply everything in the first bracket times everything in the second bracket, and then gather like terms. If we multiplied this out, we would go that times that. What's 2 times 3? 6. What's x times x? So 2x times 3x is, okay, there's going to be a 6x squared. Right? Also, Nicole, what's positive 1 times positive 4? The last term is going to be a positive 4. The last 2 terms gave you the last term, usually. This middle term came from this times this, and this times that. That's where your first outside, inside, last comes from. Zach, what's 2x times 4? What's 2 times 4? What's 2x times 4? 8x. Stop, remember that. What's 1 times 3x? What's 8x plus 3x? Because that's really what you have there. Positive 11x. That's what you did. In your prime last year, most of you reached the point where you could almost do these in your head. If not, Tatiana, feel free to do them the long way. We did a review of this at the beginning of the year too. At the beginning of the year, we said, hey, Tatiana, what's 3x times 4? Oh, well, let's fill this in. What's 3x times 4x? Not 12x. That would be 3x times 4. 12x squared, because there's an x times x. Yes, 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 yes. Tatiana, what's 3x times positive 3? Positive 9x. What's negative 2 times 4x? Negative 2 times 4? Negative 8x, is that what you said? And then what's negative 2 times positive 3, Ashley? And then when you gathered like terms, you said, hey, there's a 12x squared, there's a minus 6, but I can combine these two. 9x, take away 8x is how many x's? Positive 1x, although we didn't always write the 1 in front. Right? This one we did gathering like terms in our head, Zach. I showed you, if you know the first term gives you the first term and the last two terms give you the last two terms, the middle come from the middle two and the outside two. You can sometimes keep track of that, Joel, in your head if you're lazy, and go ahead. What that means is, Joel, that 6x squared plus 11x plus 4 factors into that. If I know that these multiply to give me this, going backwards, that means that this factors into that. That means that 12x squared plus 1x minus 6 factors into 3x minus 2, 4x plus 3. If I know what multiplies to get there, then I know the factors. Got a pen? Okay. Write this down? Okay. What we're going to ask ourselves, Joel, is what if I give you this? Can you find that? Okay. One method is using algebra tiles. I'm going to say, skip the page. Instead, we're going to go to page 386. We're going to use the method of decomposition. We're going to decompose. Okay? How? Well, it walks you through some questions. Instead, we're going to go right to page 387, example 3, and try this. It says, factor this. It says using the method of decomposition, Alyssa, but that's the only way you can factor this. Now, are you ready, Alyssa? What kind of a term is this? It's a quadratic. How do you know? It's got a squared. How many terms are there, grand total? 3. Does the quadratic term have something yucky in front of it? Yes. Okay, that's the really quick series of questions you're going to ask. If this wasn't there, we would look for two numbers that multiply to positive 6 and add to positive 7. We're going to look for two numbers that multiply to positive 12 and add to positive 7. Can you see where I got that 12 from? The first and the last. Okay. Are there two numbers, David, that multiply to positive 12 and add to positive 7? 4 and 3? Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do what's called decompose this trinomial. We're going to break up this term. We drop down the 2x squared. Drop it down. We drop down the positive 6 at the end. But we decompose this 7x into, David, what two numbers? A positive 4x and a positive 3x. That's step 1. You okay with that, Natasha? Then what you're going to do in your mind is kind of divide this in half. If you want to, you can do a really light little line down the middle. Kayla, what you do is you take the GCF out of the first two terms. What is the GCF out of the first two terms? And what would be left behind when you factor a greatest common factor? Well, when I factor a 2 out of a 2, what's left behind? A 1. When I factor an x out of an x squared, what's left behind? I'm not going to put the 1, but x. Plus, when I factor a 2x out of a 4x, what's left behind? A 2. So far, so good, Joel? We do the same thing for the last two terms. We take a GCF out of the last two terms. What is the GCF out of the last two terms, Joel? What goes into both of those? 3. Positive 3, so write plus 3 for positive 3. Bracket. When I factor a 3, Joel, out of a 3x, what's left behind? When I factor a 3 out of a positive 6, what's left behind? Positive or negative? Reminds me to put a plus sign there. Joel, you know you've done this right if both your little brackets are identical. Sam, are both my little brackets identical? That's your partway through Tatiana error check. Back here. Okay. What's the final answer? Look up. Watch. You see how I got the final answer from that line there, Kiara? It's the one of your factors is the bracket. The other factor is the coefficient of each bracket. Yeah. Same thing. By the way, how could I check? I could quickly FOIL this out. Watch, 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 watch. What's 2x times x? 2x squared. What's 3 times 2? 6. 3x, 4x, 7x. This is the decomposition method. Nicole, it's called the decomposition method because you decompose this middle term into where it came from. And it's very similar to what we were doing last day, Alexis, except instead of finding two numbers that multiply to 6 and add to 7, it's multiply to this and that and add to the middle. B. What kind of a term is this? It's a quadratic. How do I know, Ashley? It's got a squared. How many terms are there? GCF? No. It'd be nice if I could pull that 5 out because then I wouldn't have to go through this. Is there something in front of the quadratic term? Something yucky? Then I'm going to look for two numbers that multiply to what? Positive 10. See it, Rachel? And what are they going to add to, Rachel? Yep. What are two numbers that multiply to positive 10 and add to 7? 5 and 2. So we drop the first term down. We drop the last term down. We decompose this 7x into a 5x and a 2x. In our mind, draw a little line there. GCF out of the first term. And what's left behind? And a plus and a, careful, a 1. If we've done this right, the second bracket should be the same thing. GCF out of here. Now, by the way, what if nothing worked? There is still a common factor. It's the obvious one that we always forget about that goes into anything. 1. If nothing works, factor out a 1, because sometimes 1s do appear in your final answer. That's how they show up. Positive 2x plus 1. Is our error check okay? Then, Alexis, what's my final answer going to be? What two brackets? Or Kiara, 5x plus 2x plus 1. I usually find it easier just to drop that first bracket down because it's almost always right above my first bracket, and then boom, boom. It just mentally that works for my brain, but I'm weird, left-handed, and a nerd. Your brain might work different. Sadly, if you don't know your times tables, Adrian, there's really no easy way around this. You got to know your times tables to get those two numbers in the first place. Let's try some, but this time with some negatives. It makes it a bit trickier. Same idea, though. Example 4 says factor. Okay. I'm going to look for... oh, sorry. What kind of a term is this? It's a quadratic. Zach, how do I know? The squared. How many terms are there? GCF? Ah! Is there something yucky in front of the squared term? Okay. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to what? Careful. Negative 18. I usually write that off somewhere in the margin. You can write mult, negative 18 if you want to. I usually put the negative 18. And add to what? positive 17. What are two numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to positive 17? Ah! We sometimes forget the obvious. Yeah, the 1 times table. 18 and 1 will work. Let's see. Drop the 6x squared down. Drop the minus 3 down. Is it going to be positive 18 and negative 1, or is it going to be negative 18 and positive 1? Sorry? Is that okay, Nicole? Back here now. In your mind, or with a little pencil, very lightly, chop it in half. Joel, GCF in the first term, what? Doesn't 6 go into 6 and 8? 6x, yes? Yeah. And what will be left behind? An x, a plus, and a 3. Do the test, Marcus. Stay focused. I know, this is so much fun. You want to just watch. I know. Shallon, GCF out of the last term. Put your pencils down. Ah! What? Did you hear her? She said, first of all, nothing works. So she tried 1. But when you tried 1, did your bracket match? No. And Mr. Dueck, what did you try instead? There is a second GCF that always works. What? Negative 1. If I factor out a negative 1, when I factor a negative 1 from a negative 1x, actually, won't that make it positive? And when I factor a negative 1 from a negative 3, won't that make it positive? And now do my brackets match? Nice catch. Nice catch. That's the also slightly tricky part with this method, is you have to pay attention to the signs. Adrian, what's my final answer? Yep. Okay. That's it. That's the whole lesson. We'll do a couple more to practice, and then I'm going to shut up. I'm going to try and give you lots of time to work on the homework so that those of you that have handed in the stats review have no homework for your long weekend. You want to try this one on your own? I'll do it slow. Yeah. I'll try it slowly up here. Let's see. See if we get in the same place. So I went, got to multiply negative 24 and negative 2, add to negative 2. 6 and 4. Negative 6 and positive 4. That's what will add to the negative 2. Negative 6 and positive 4. GCF from the first one was 3x. That left me with an x minus 2. I was going to factor out a 4 from the second one, but then I went, oh, that's going to leave me with a... Am I wrong? I can factor out a 4, Mr. Dueck. It is a plus. Is it that, Jacob? Why didn't you tell me? Factored out of 4. If this had been all opposite, I would have factored out a -4. The trick that Shaolin already showed us. How many of you got that okay? Yeah. Sorry? (3x+2), not 3x+4. Is that what you're saying? No. No, it's 3x. I factored out a 4 in my GCF, I'm pretty sure. Yep. Let's try a couple more. Quadratic. GCF? No. How many terms? 3. Something in front of the quadratic term? Yep. So, numbers that multiply to +12 and add to -8. Drop the 12t squared down. Drop the +1 down. What are two numbers that multiply to +12 and add to -8? -6t minus 2t. Okay. I'll bite. Nicole, what's my GCF from the first two terms? Sorry, I can't hear. Careful, 6t. And left behind is going to be a 2 and a t. Yes. And a minus and a 1. Is that right? I want my second bracket to be +2t minus 1. What's my GCF here? I was going to say 1, but that's not quite going to work. You know what my GCF's going to be over here? -1. And that's going to give me a +2 and a -1. Now my brackets match. Chelsea, what's my final answer, kiddo? Yep. Weird ones. These two here. We're going to do B first. What kind of a term is B? It's a quadratic. How do I know? It's got a squared. What's the first thing that I always... Is there one? What? 5. Now the reason this is nice, Joel, is if I didn't spot that, I'd be looking for two numbers that multiply to -150 and add to 5. Do you know your 150 times table? No, me neither. But watch. Let's factor out a 5. When I do that, when I factor a 5 out of the first term, Zach, what's going to be left behind, kiddo? Careful, we're dividing when we factor. 3x squared plus, when I factor a 5 out of a 5, yeah, minus. And now, left behind in the brackets is still a quadratic, and it's still got something in front of the quadratic term. But can you see, now I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -6. Joel, do you know your -6 times table better than you know your -150 times table? This is why you always try and factor a GCF out first. It's a good habit to develop. Every year I have kids that don't get that habit, and they spend 20 minutes on this, when really I planned on them spending 2. Drop the 5 down. That's not going to vanish. That's going to remain in front of everything for the rest of the question. But let's look at this. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to what, Rob, and add to what? Add to, multiply to -6 and add to +1, right? What are two numbers that multiply to -6 and add to +1? So Rob, I can break I can decompose this x up into a positive 3x and a minus 2x, which is still technically a 1x like it was originally. I can Rachel, I dropped the 5 down. Sam, what's my GCF in the first two terms? Oh, by the way, I got sloppy here. I forgot to drop the I forgot to write the quadratic. Whoops. Squared. What's my GCF from the first two terms? I totally and completely agree with you. And left behind would be what? X plus 1. What's my GCF from the last two terms? I was going to take a 2 out, but do the positives and negatives match if I take a 2 out? Negative 2. And I get an X and a plus and a 1. Yeah? Final answer. The 5 drops down. What is this? Oh. X plus 1. Right, Ashley? And what's your third bracket gonna be? Your third term, your second bracket gonna be? Adrian, you can get there by finding two numbers that multiply to negative 150 and add to positive 5. Telling you, if you spot the GCF first, you're a much, much happier camper. Okay. What don't you like about A? What's weird about it compared to all of the other questions we've done so far? The squared's at the end, and not only is the squared at the end, what do you notice about the quadratic term? It's negative. First thing, let's rewrite it like this. This is a negative 2x squared. Let's put it first. And then a minus 7x. And what's in front of this 15? It's invisible. Positive or negative? So I better put a plus 15. I just moved them around. I still don't like that the quadratic term is negative. I don't know if you remember, last day I said there's a reason why we never teach you how to factor a negative quadratic. And the reason is you don't need to. I'm going to factor out a GCF. You know what my GCF's going to be? Negative 1. Because that's going to go positive, positive, negative. I don't mind if the other terms are negative. It's that quadratic term that's yucky. Sorry? Sorry? I've got to factor out a negative 1 out of everything. Yeah, because it's well, the negative has to be there, definitely. And just having a negative in front of a bracket looks yucky, so let's put a 1 there. Now, Kayla, we look at what's inside the bracket. GCF? No. Is it a quadratic? Yeah. 3 terms? Yeah. Is there something in front of the quadratic term? Oh. Okay. I'm going to still drop the negative 1 down, but for this, if I'm factoring it, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to what and add to what? Alexis, multiply to, did you say negative 30? Because you'd be right. And add to, what are two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to positive 7? Positive 10, negative 3? Yes? Okay. So if I hear you, we're going to break this down into a positive 10x and a negative 3x. Drop the negative 1 in front down. Oh, and in your mind, break this up kind of in half. GCF from the first two terms? 2x. Bracket. X plus what? 5. GCF from the last two terms? 3. Not 3. Negative 3, yeah? Because that's going to give me a positive x plus 5. My built-in error check, the brackets are identical. Final answer. The -1 stays in front. David, what do you think? Or x plus 5, 2x minus 3. But there would have to be either, Kayla, just plain old a negative in front, or a -1 in front, or they might have multiplied the negative into one of these brackets. You might see this. Was that positive originally? Is it negative now? Was that positive originally? Oop. You may see that. Or they may multiply the negative into there. I don't like this as much as saying, look, why don't I have all the x's if possible, be positive, and pull a -1 out in front. You can see what's going on. That's factoring trinomials with a leading coefficient. That's the fancy way, Joel, of saying that's factoring 3 terms when there's something in front of the quadratic term. We tweak our original method and we use what's called a decomposition method. You need to practice this. So, what's your homework? 3 all. 4 all. That's 12 questions so far. 6 has some of the weird ones. Yeah, we'll pause there. I think that's good. If you finish the factoring homework and you want to work on the stats review, go ahead.